everybody, to our July episode of the S Word, a podcast about suicide prevention. My name is Sarah Kolbeck. I'm an assistant professor in psychiatry and behavioral medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and I direct our division of suicide prevention in our Comprehensive Injury Center. And after a month off, I am very glad to be back recording with Andrew. Yes.
And hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Schramm. I'm a clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Surgery and in the Division of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery at Medical College of Wisconsin. So happy to have you all with us today.
Yes. And we're so excited for our guest this morning, Gail Urso with Kevin's Song. Before we get started, though, I just want to spend a couple minutes reminding you of some resources that are available. If you're ever concerned about yourself or a loved one, you can dial or text 988. That is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week confidential crisis and lifeline. You don't have to be in suicide crisis to utilize 988, but certainly feel free to access that resource if needed. There's also the crisis text line, which you can reach by texting the word talk to 741-741. Again, that's a confidential service available 24/7. And as just a quick content reminder, just want to remind our listeners that we will be talking about issues related to suicide and suicide prevention today. And so if at any time you feel like you need to take a break, please feel free to hit pause and come back, and we will be here when you return. I am really excited to welcome our guest this morning. Our guest is Gail Urso, and she is the co-founder of Kevin's Song, which is an organization that we're going to be talking about this morning. When I was doing a little bit of research about Kevin's Song, I was really excited to also learn that Gail was the recipient of the American Association of Suicidology's 2023 Lost Survivor Award. And so congratulations for that, Gail. That's an honor, and I'm sure very well deserved. So welcome to the podcast this morning, Gail. We are so glad to have you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to, like I said, I did some research into Kevin's Song as I was preparing for today's episode, but I would love for you to tell us about your organization. What is the story of Kevin's Song and what inspired this work?
Well, I'd be happy to. Kevin's Song has been in existence for 10 years. We actually founded the organization in 2013, the same year we lost our son, Kevin, to suicide. Kevin was 41 when he died. He lived in Florida. We're in Michigan. We had seen Kevin just a month, 6 weeks prior to his death. And we've often looked back on how we came home from the trip visiting him and thought how good he seemed. And when he died by suicide, we were of course, we were devastated, but we were also shocked because we never had thought it was a possibility. Mm-hmm. Not only was it the kind of thought that, well, this is what happens to other people, but it literally was not in our consciousness. And we consider ourselves both pretty educated, well-informed people. We had no idea that suicide was as prevalent in our country and in the world as it is. In fact, the year Kevin died by suicide, approximately 45,000 people in this country died by suicide.
Right.
So I believe it was a month after Kevin died, possibly May. He died in March, possibly May. Newsweek magazine came out with a cover story. And I'll never forget it because it was just so eye-opening. It was called The Suicide Epidemic. And at that time, Newsweek was only doing an online version of their magazine. And it was like a 26-page article with all kinds of information and resources. And so John and I realized that if we didn't know, probably a lot of other people didn't know also what a possibility suicide was. If it could happen to us, it could happen to anyone. And so we decided to do something with our grief, with the energy from what had happened. And we decided to form this organization. And we had wonderful friends who joined us in the effort. And our primary goal when we created this nonprofit organization was to educate the community at large. I mean, just let people know what we did not know. And so we decided to create a website that would have resources. Oh, I should say that one of the things that we learned during the space of the months between Kevin's death and when we formed Kevin's Song was that there were all these wonderful organizations that were dealing with suicide prevention, but we had never heard of any of them. And what we found was that many of them had never connected with each other.
Mm.
And so we decided we would form a website that would have resources and helpful information. We decided to create a film. And if we have enough time, I'd love to tell you how that idea came about. But we wanted to have a film that was talked about suicide, not just about mental health issues. And oh, by the way, suicide, we wanted it to deal with suicide. We were successful in doing that. We created a film called Death is Not the Answer. And a rather renowned filmmaker, Keith Famey, created the film for us. And the third thing we wanted to do was have a conference. And at the time we created the Kevin's Song, the conference idea was a little bit vague, but we just thought it would be a good opportunity to bring people together. So in hindsight, 10 years ago, looking back 10 years, those were all good ideas for projects because each of them has continued to be implemented by Kevin's Song and has grown in scope and impact. The website you've seen, I would refer people to kevinsong.org. The film, we actually have now created quite a few short documentary films that some are available on our website. Some of them are available through our website.
Okay.
But, I want to just, as quickly as I can, tell you the story of why we thought of making a film.
Yes, please do.
Okay. In February of 2013, I have a very dear friend who lives on the other side of town, about an hour, 50 minutes away. And she invited me to come see a documentary film that a clinical psychologist friend of hers had created called Transforming Loss. The film is called Transforming Loss. And if you're familiar with it, it's absolutely excellent. Anyway, this friend asked me to come, and the last thing I wanted to do on a cold Tuesday night in February was drive across town to see this film. But I did. And the film tells the story of, I think it's 7 individuals or couples who have suffered a traumatic loss. And the grieving process they go through over approximately 5 years. And at the end, and the film was very well done. It was hard to watch, but it was very heartening and in the end uplifting because all of the stories had outcomes that, showed people surviving and thriving in their grief. And at the end, the lights went on. And I remember all the people who had been in the film were in the audience and stood up and
Wow.
acknowledged everyone turned around, smiled, waved. And about a month later, our son died. And of course, when you get a phone call like that, you'll never forget it. It's devastating. But I also remember that day I I thought about that film,
Hmm.
and I thought people got through their grief, or they got through their tragedies. We can do this.
Yeah.
And that thought was with me going forward. So I was so happy I had made that trek across town to see the film. So grateful for the film. I can't recommend it highly enough. And I I think that it was because of that that I realized the impact a film could make. And that was why we decided that one of our goals would be to produce a film. So that's my story about the film.
Yeah.
Anyway, Kevin, Kevin's song, from the time we got started, um, has met with a very, I don't want to use the word enthusiastic, but um, just a lot of support. We've had support from the media, which has been really helpful because that was one of the things we were hoping for, so that average people like us would know our story and
Right.
know that it too could happen to them. I mean,
Mhm.
so many people have thanked us for talking about our loss publicly. I'll never forget after the memorial service we had for Kevin, in which we publicly spoke about his death. A woman came up to me as we were walking out of the church, and she said, "My father died from suicide 30 years ago, and I have never told a soul. And now I
Wow.
feel like I can talk about it."
Wow.
So we had our first conference in 2016, and this is another one of those stories that I like to tell, but as we were putting it together, we knew what content we wanted it to have, but how were we going to get people to come? So I had saved that Newsweek magazine article. In that Newsweek magazine, the focus of the article was Dr. Thomas Joyner from
Hmm.
Florida State University, who, of course, is like one of the gurus of suicidology. And it told about his own personal loss of his father, but the work he's done. And so I thought,
Yes.
well, why don't I just see if Dr. Joyner will come and be a keynote speaker?
Wow.
So I sent him a long email thinking in 2 weeks I might hear from someone that is in his office. Within 2 hours, he had responded and accepted
Oh my
our
God.
invitation.
That's
Wow.
Well,
amazing.
once you have Dr. Thomas Joyner coming to be your keynote speaker, there was absolutely no trouble getting other speakers or medical and mental health professionals to come to the conference.
Hmm.
And he has come every year since.
Wow.
But it it was a very uh, important beginning, and the conference has just continued to grow and become better and better each year. It's We now have approximately 400 people who attend, mostly mental health professionals, educators, medical personnel, and different targeted audiences, depending. Sometimes veterans, sometimes first responders, sometimes clergy, depending on the areas that we're trying to focus on.
Sure.
Mhm.
So our,
No,
our
can I
conference,
ask-
our next conference is scheduled for the end of January 2024.
Wonderful. Yeah. Gail, can I ask, when did you produce the film, and when was the first year of the conference?
I believe it was 2016. And I believe that that's the year that the film was produced,
Wow. Okay.
because I remember that we had the premiere as the first night at the conference.
Oh, wow. Wow. I'm wondering, Gail, it sounds like for the film, part of your goal was to kind of increase visibility of suicide prevention to kind of the general public, so
True.
to say. And so I'm curious, it seems like the shift, there was a shift in your focus a bit, or an added focus for the conference in terms of mental health professionals. Am I hearing that right? Or
Well,
tell me more about the goals for the conference, if you would.
that's very interesting. I think when we started, the idea of having a conference was more to get media attention
Mhm.
so that the public would learn that we were doing this.
Yep,
Does that make sense?
it does.
Like,
Yep.
we thought if we have a conference in Detroit about suicide, someone's going to pay attention to that.
Absolutely.
So I think from there, and that's a great question, because it does take me back to how we got started.
Mhm.
Um, and we did get some media attention. I remember specifically the local NBC channel, WDIV, did a nice, very nice story, and a number of the channels picked it up. So in that sense, we accomplished what we wanted. But the people who came, it turned out, were the mental health professionals.
Mhm.
And they were all so happy, so appreciative to have an opportunity to attend a conference of the quality this was.
Mhm.
Um, that, they just come back every year and more people come. But yes, you're right. When we started, we weren't thinking that we were going to be teaching anybody anything.
Mhm.
I mean, since that time, we have learned that there is a dire need for mental health professionals to get this information,
Absolutely.
because, as I'm sure you know very well, most schools don't prepare their students who are going to be therapists to deal with suicide.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, that was shocking. I think it's really sad and a
Mm.
problem. I know some states have some requirements, but Michigan at this time does not. And that's something we're trying to address. So I think that as people began to come together and understand the importance of what they were learning, um, the word spread.
Mhm.
The other thing that was really great, that I don't think we've paid enough attention to, is the fact that we always have a resource gallery, and we have probably 30 organizations that come together to share, to have tables and spread information, and they network. And so there have been many times where I've heard, like months later, that this organization from the west side of our state had a speaker that they heard at our conference, who maybe was from the Upper Peninsula, speak at something they were doing. So there have been a lot of connections made, and the state of Michigan now is, I think, doing. I mean, there are a lot of very active, wonderful organizations in Michigan, and in fact, Governor Whitmer has created a commission on suicide prevention with some of the top people in the field from Michigan
That's-
on that panel, on the commission. Kevin Song actually created another organization called With One Voice. And because we realized that to accomplish certain things, it would be much easier if you had a united voice rather than just individual nonprofits or community mental health agencies from around the state, addressing an issue. If all of these folks got together and spoke with one voice, there would be much more leverage. So this is a completely separate now nonprofit organization with, I believe, about 100 organizations from around the state who are participating. And it's kind of getting off the ground. They have a board of directors now and goals, and are looking for funding and so on. But I think it's going to be really effective.
It's exciting to hear about the multiple avenues that you're taking to impact change around this. And I want to name that I'm sorry that you had the impetus to do this work. I don't know, it feels important just to name that, but also really an honor to hear about all the meaning that you've made from this. And so thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you. And I understand and appreciate the way you worded that. And it kind of goes back to the honor that you mentioned I received in the beginning. It's certainly a mixed blessing.
Right.
It's wonderful to be the recipient of this national award, but you only receive that if you've lost someone to suicide. So
yeah. I want to echo that. And I appreciate you making space for that, Andrew, because it is, that there was that loss and there was Kevin's life, and, the way that you all are honoring it. And one of the things that you said earlier that stuck out to me was the story about the woman who came up to you at Kevin's memorial, whose father had died, and they just never talked about it. And you think about, carrying that. And so, what you all have done through Kevin's song to bring that conversation out of the darkness and into the light, I think is just so needed and lovely and important. So I just want to thank you for the work that you do.
well, thank you. And really, I very much appreciate that. What our work has made us realize, though, is there are a lot of people out there doing this work. I mean, you're obviously two of them. There are people at the university level. There are people in small community centers. There are people in hospitals. There is a lot of work being done, but there is so much work to be done. And I'll never forget Thomas Joyner at the very first conference of ours that he spoke at. So that would have been 2016. Said, in the world of cancer research, he said, 100 years ago, no one talked about cancer. Today we have pink ribbons on pizza boxes. He said, in the world of suicide, we're at about year 25. And I thought that was very sobering, but I think it's so true. I mean, there are so many unanswered questions. I mean, when you look at the population of people who die by suicide, you have every sex, race, ethnicity, income level. It doesn't matter. It crosses all of mankind. Now, obviously, certain populations are more at risk. We know that. But there is so much to learn, so much that has to be learned. And, the research end of it is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. You've talked a lot about your your experience and how, loss by suicide is something that is not always talked about, and your organization obviously is working on changing that. And one of the things that I encounter in the work that I do is, talking to folks who, maybe haven't experienced a suicide in their life. What would you say to somebody maybe who is looking to support somebody that has lost a family member or a loved one to suicide? What would you want them to know to help support that person who's grieving from a loss by suicide?
That's a really great question, because I think people are they always worry about, how do you do this?
Absolutely.
First of all, you've lost someone. It doesn't matter how you've lost them. I mean, in one sense, you've just lost a person that was important to you in your life. So in that sense, it's a death, and you need to reach out and support that person. People often don't know what to say. And the
Right.
thing, you just say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss. It's, I remember when we lost Kevin. Of course, we had to leave the state. We went down to Florida, but when we came back, our friends they'd bring over food. They'd drop off at dinner, or they send cards, or they send flowers, or just a note, I'm thinking of you, a text message.
Right.
The worst thing is if people don't acknowledge what's happened. I would
Mm-hmm.
say that's the worst.
Yeah.
The other thing I think it's important for people to know is that in being supportive, you want to let people know you're there for them. You're happy to talk, but you don't ask questions. You
Mm.
don't ask any for details of what
Sure.
happened ever.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it's amazing how many people do that. And so that I would say is one of the absolute no-nos.
Yeah.
Uh, and we run some support groups, Kevin Song does. And support groups are so important for loss survivors, because they can talk with other people who have experienced someone losing someone to suicide. And that is one thing that this whole conversation comes up frequently. So Sarah, it's a great question, because from the viewpoint of the loss survivor, they want the death to be acknowledged. They want people
Right.
to reach out, just like, I mean, I'm going, after we have this today, I'm going to meet a friend for lunch who lost her husband a couple of weeks ago,
Oh my
just
gosh.
to meet with her.
Mhm.
I would do the same thing with someone who lost someone to suicide. It doesn't matter.
Right. Right.
And the other thing, I guess the other thing that comes to mind is that the person who dies by suicide ends their life because they're in so much pain they can't go on. But that's not who they were.
Right.
They were so
Mhm.
much more than that.
Yeah.
And so that's what you talk about with them,
Mhm.
and with the survivors. So I think the most important thing is to just be there for someone. Just, even if you say, I don't know what to say, I'm just
Mhm.
sorry for your loss. I'll miss this person too. Just to be there and to check in with them, to not ask for any details, because that is so painful and hard for the survivors to deal with.
Mhm.
And you would certainly know that from,
Mhm.
I'm sure, your work with trauma and so on. I mean, that's that's another whole issue. But
Mhm.
the
And if I could add, I think that those details not being necessary to provide support. You know?
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
it's very, very important. And I mean, we have probably a 100, if not more, loss survivors who we deal with all the time. I don't know how any of their people died. I don't
Mhm,
care to know. It doesn't matter.
mhm,
So I just think that is a really important point.
mhm.
And yeah, so it's just I've heard so many stories of people who say, oh, I run into someone in the grocery store, or I went to a dinner party. Not one person said anything to me about the fact I lost my son.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah.
I think people are just so afraid. There still is a stigma. We know that attached to suicide. I think
Mhm.
it's better. I think the more we talk about it, the more people understand. But there's still a stigma attached to it, and I think that's part of what makes it difficult for some people to know how to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. Um, Gail, in your work with many survivors of a loss from suicide, um, I'm wondering about the kind of v- variability in the ways of coping or grieving that you see. And so for your family, you've found great comfort and meaning in this work that you're doing really soon after
Yeah,
the loss of your son. I'm curious, do you see that looking differently for other survivors that you work with? Could you comment on maybe how you've seen grief play out differently for people?
absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I will say that one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story about seeing the film Transforming Loss is that in that film, those survivors of different kinds of tragedies all coped with their grief in different ways.
Mhm,
And a couple of them had done something similar to what we've done. And I think that was probably important in our decision to move forward. Not that we ever discussed the film, but just knowing that doing something, because that's kind of our nature. My
mhm,
husband and I are like people who like to organize things and do things. And so it was a way for us to use our energy. It's definitely not for everyone.
mhm,
And there are people who need time alone, who like reading seems to be very, very helpful for people who have lost someone to suicide. A lot of people find comfort in their church or their synagogue, their community that they belong to. I think the most important thing is that there be no pressure to do anything, but to just go where
mhm,
your heart takes you and know that it's okay. It could be a year, it could be 3 years, it could be 6 weeks, before you decide to become active, perhaps with us, become involved with a support group, or um, it's such an individual thing,
yeah,
and I think it's so important to honor your own self and your feelings and what's good for you. We were fortunate that my husband and I both were in the same place about doing something.
mhm,
And we weren't completely in the same place about how we dealt with the grief, but we were of a similar mind that we could do something, that we should do something about this. But no, I think it's so important for people to just be wherever they are. We know how grief affects people so differently. So I hope that answers your
it
question.
does. Thank you. Mhm.
I want to make sure that before we wrap up the episode today, that we spend some time hearing about Kevin and his life. You mentioned earlier that people are so much more than their suicide, and so I just thought this would be an opportunity for us to hear a little bit about Kevin and his life. If you'd be willing to share, I'd
Oh,
like to
yeah,
talk about him and hear about his life a little bit.
sure. Thank you for the chance, really.
Yeah.
Um, Kevin was our oldest son. We have 3 sons. Kevin was the oldest. And Kevin was a very bright, very talented young man. He he was very verbal from a very, very early age. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was very funny. In fact, there were people who really thought he could have made a living being a stand-up comedian.
Wow.
He had a beautiful singing voice.
Mhm.
He was very shy. Um, I will say that from a very early age, he was challenging. And I suppose because he was our first, I didn't realize how challenging he was until I had 2 more, and they seemed so much easier. But he always had his own way of doing things. He I would say feisty, um, but challenging when I look back. I remember I reading every my master's degree was in child development. Well, I realized I didn't know much at all. So I remember doing a lot of reading and trying to figure out how to, and then of course we were first time parents too, so that makes a difference. But he in hindsight, I think Kevin dealt with some depression from a very early age that no one understood. We took him to we went to family counseling. He saw a therapist from time to time. No one ever suggested that he suffered from depression.
Mm.
He did have ADHD. That was diagnosed when he was probably 15, and which seems old, but you know, you have to also remember at this time, things were just we were beginning to understand all of
Mhm.
this, and doctors were and so on. But he did have ADHD, and so school was a challenge for him. And we all knew how bright he was. So I think, and he knew. So I think that was extremely frustrating for him. But by the time he got to high school, we had trouble getting him to go to school. And that's where I think the depression became a factor. He continued to, I said he was shy. He had this gorgeous singing voice, but when he was in a school choir, he would not sing. And you know, things like that were always made him challenging or seem different, and it was hard to understand why he would react to certain things the way he did. But meanwhile, he kept us all very engaged with his humor and he loved animals. He was huge animal lover. And we always had pets, and he was always wonderful with them. And as he got older, he would find stray pets to bring home. Um, he ended up um, going to college for 2 years, where he was studying social work.
Okay.
And we think he would have made a wonderful therapist,
Mhm.
just would have been great. But he took an internship at the Children's Home of Detroit, which was a facility that provided homes for young people who were wards of the court. And he became a very much loved employee of that organization. I mean, I
Yeah.
still run into people all the time who either served on the board or worked there and knew Kevin and talked about how fabulous he was with
Wow.
these children. And I didn't mention, because I didn't think of it, Kevin was adopted.
Okay.
And, that never meant anything to us, but I think it always meant something to him.
Mm-hmm.
And in later years, he found his birth family. We know them. We're in touch with them. We did find that depression runs in both of his birth parents.
Yeah.
In fact, we learned that his birth father lost 2 brothers to suicide.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
don't know what that means, but it was certainly interesting. Kevin seemed to have found a lot more peace as he got older, although he moved to Florida because the weather, the grayness in Michigan bothered him so much. He was seeing a therapist. He was diagnosed with depression. He moved to Florida to have more sunshine. He loved the beach. He loved the water. He had found a job, but then he got laid off. So he was looking for a job. He had a significant other, a woman that had moved with him from Florida, who was, we think, wonderful for him. And so I think we could say that he did suffer from depression probably for a good part of his life.
Yeah.
And in the end, the consequence was, but when I say, I mean, we did not, as parents, recognize some of the signs and symptoms of depression. Even when we saw Kevin the month before he died, and we thought he was so great, he had lost a lot of weight. We
Okay.
didn't realize that was a symptom of depression. And I don't say that in the sense of blaming ourselves, and we just
Right.
didn't know.
Yeah.
But that's one
Yeah.
of the reasons we want to share
Right.
whatever we didn't know with other people, because it can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think Kevin, like so many, one of the things Dr. Joyner talks about is how one of the things everyone has in common who takes their life is they don't want to be a burden to other people.
Right. Yeah.
That burdensomeness. So you keep inside how badly you're feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that was certainly true of Kevin. We actually think also that Kevin had probably made the decision much earlier to end his life, and that he was feeling good
Yeah.
because he had decided to end his life.
Yeah.
It's hard to paint a picture of Kevin. He was such a complicated person, but very endearing, engaging, funny, loving, kind, but
So
also
compassionate.
complicated.
Yeah. 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 We really appreciate you sharing his story a little bit more. And, through kind of hearing that story, the mission and the work of Kevin's song clicks even more for me, for sure, because I think, hearing about your experience and just not knowing, and then that desire and drive to bring as much of that information to folks as possible through Kevin's song and the work that you're doing. Just again, I think it's a beautiful way to honor his life and to do such important work that is, as you've said, so needed even today. So thank you so much for that and for sharing.
Well, thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
And so the website is kevinsong.org. And you mentioned that the conference is coming up at the end of January over in Detroit. I'm going to try and make it this year. I was looking at the schedule last year and it just didn't work with my timing, but I hope I get to make it over there this year. And is there information about the conference on the website, I'm assuming?
Yes, there is.
Oh, perfect.
And I will also mention that we have a list of books. I mentioned that people often find it helpful to read. There are in our resources. We feature a book a month, and we have a wonderful collection of books. There's also on the homepage, there is a wonderful article by Father Ron Wollheiser that I recommend everyone read, which is called Suicide, the Most Misunderstood Death.
Mm.
And it's really very valuable. So
Good.
yes, it'd be wonderful to see you at our
It
conference.
would, yes, I would love to meet you in person, and we'll make sure that we have that Kevin song linked in our caption for folks so that they can get to your site easily.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much, Gail. We really appreciated having you today and learning about Kevin's song and learning a little bit more about Kevin. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you,
take
Gail.
care. Just a reminder for our listeners, if you are ever concerned about yourself or a loved one, you can dial or text 988, the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can also text the helpline, which is the text crisis line, by texting the word talk to 741-741. We hope that you take some time to do something nice for yourself today, and we look forward to seeing you for our next episode in August. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.